Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about something which is always a great source of amusement for me, and that's people in the bodybuilding world who are worried that doing deadlifts is going to give them a thicker waist. They always worry about this, and it's really funny when you think about it, because part of the thing is that you've got to wonder why guys really worry about having a really small waist. As if having a really small waist is something desirable for men. And I understand there are people who pursue the classic aesthetics thing, and I get that. But first of all, you've got to wonder what the mentality is outside of that, because again, who cares? Who cares about having a really small waist outside of a tiny niche community? But even if we set that aside, even if we step back and we say, well, we don't want a big, massive waist because I want to be aesthetic, I want this, I want that, you've got to question the logic behind why they even think this is going to be the case. Because when you look at it objectively, what will most of these people tell you? What will they generally tell you when it comes to making a muscle bigger? They will usually say things like higher volume training tends to produce more muscle growth, right? In other words, that really low volume training with heavy weights isn't the best way to gain muscle mass, right? Most of these people will tell you that. That tends to go hand in hand with people who train for bodybuilding. They believe in hypertrophy training. They will also tell you that partials don't generally build as much muscle as full range of motion exercises do. Now that's pretty well agreed upon by the science. The research agrees on that full range of motion has more potential for muscle growth than partials do. That's not really that big of a point of contention, is it? Yet these people will stand here and say, well, the deadlift will give you a thick waist. It'll build all those muscles up. Yet they don't train with high volumes on deadlifts. Most people can't do really high volumes of training on their deadlifts, can they? It's actually relatively difficult to use the deadlift as a hypertrophy exercise due to the nature of the lift. It tends to bury people. It's a very difficult exercise to recover from when you do high volume. So all these people out there who will worry about their waistline growing from deadlifts will also try to tell you that the deadlift isn't a particularly good hypertrophy exercise. And all the muscles of the waistline, the abs, the obliques, all of these things are only moved through a very short range of motion on the deadlift. In fact, they're basically stabilizers on this exercise. So when you step back and think about that, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? That people would be legitimately worried about that happening. Yet, what do all of these people do who stand there and will swear up and down that they don't do the heavy deadlift because they don't want it to thicken their waist? These very same people will do high volume crunches. They will do weighted crunches, hanging leg raises, they'll do side raises, all sorts of side crunches. These people will go do full range of motion exercises for their abdominals and for their obliques using high reps and high volume for what purpose? For hypertrophy. They will do hypertrophy specific training for the muscles of their waistline, while claiming they don't want to thicken their waistline. Let that sink in for a moment. If a person didn't want a muscle to get bigger, they didn't want to thicken it up, the very last thing in the world they would be do a bunch of 10 or 12 rep sets for it and move it through a full range of motion and focus on moving it through the full range of motion and squeezing it and contracting it. I thought that's what bodybuilders did because they wanted a muscle to grow. Isn't that what these same people do for their biceps to try to get their biceps to grow? So are the obliques and the abdominals different from the biceps? And that the very exercise style that people do for their biceps to make it grow won't make these muscles grow in the waist? That's a little bit silly, isn't it? It's really silly when you think about it, because these people will worry that a stabilizer used on a low volume heavy exercise is going to grow enormously disproportionate from doing that exercise And so they'll avoid it, but then they'll do a bunch of hypertrophy specific work for it so that they can focus on it and make it grow. Completely asinine. It's completely asinine. And here's the reality of it. The muscles of the abdominal wall are not particularly thick muscles. In other words, if you look at them, they're actually relatively thin sheets, and even if you were to double the size of that muscle over time, it would probably add less than an inch to your waist measurement. Unlike a muscle like the bicep or the pectoral or some of those other muscles, those are round, full muscles. All the muscles of the abdominal wall are thin. These are muscles that are less than an inch thick. If you, again, double their size, they're still not going to be particularly big. They're not going to be big. And I think where the confusion comes in is that people will see power lifters who have thicker waists, and they don't step back and think, could it be because power lifters tend to bulk a lot? Could it be that most power lifters probably don't drop into single digit body fat percentages, so therefore they don't remove all the additional fat underneath there also? Or could it be that a lot of powerlifters also use a lot of the same drugs that a lot of these bodybuilders use today who also have big, thick, massive waists? Could it also be that since the core is a stabilizer, that people who just have thicker waists tend to gravitate towards powerlifting more? In other words, maybe there's a structural thing going on. Maybe the people who are properly built to have the best deadlifts and squats tend to gravitate towards powerlifting, and those are the people you see as the examples of strong powerlifters because they have the genetics to be better at it, because they have wider hips, thicker waistlines, they have more muscle in the trunk, in the glutes and the hips in terms of total muscle fibers and frame. And that's something people don't think about with some of this stuff. They'll see different types of athletes, and no one questions that in other sports, do they, until we get around to lifting. They don't question that. No one stands there and tells people don't play basketball because it'll make you really tall. Right? We know that people who are tall, that is in many cases, not always, a genetic advantage in the sport of basketball. It's not the only gene that's important, but it's one of them, isn't it? Meaning being 6'5" or 6'7" genetically can give you an edge in basketballs, particularly when it comes to dunking. You don't have to jump as high. It's actually a useful trait for the sport. Just like having more muscle fibers in your trunk, in your glutes, and your hips gives you an advantage in powerlifting. So maybe the people who are genetically predisposed to have the best squats and the best deadlifts just build muscle easier in those areas. Just like the people who tend to make the best bodybuilders maybe have thicker and fuller muscle bellies in their biceps. And maybe it's their genetics that oftentimes give a lot of these bodybuilders the best biceps and not necessarily something specific about their training. Because a curl is a curl at the end of the day. A bicep's not exactly a complicated muscle to train. There's not like a magical secret to curling a weight. It's really only one joint involved. Something people don't always think about, do they? When they see these examples of people who compete in different endeavors, they don't step back and think, oh, how they trained, and their training must have contributed to all aspects of how they look. And they don't always go, maybe there's genetic predispositions that will then in turn affect how you look, such as your hip structure, your muscle structure, your height. Maybe those are genetic, and those are the people who just excel at certain endeavors. But no one wants to think about it that way. And that's a big part of it. It's a big part of it. And I'm not saying some powerlifting training doesn't involve thickening the core, because most powerlifters do a lot of core work on top of it. We do a lot of bulking. But again, there are genetic traits that matter also. And you know what? Here at the end of the day, I'll tell you, deadlifts are not going to thicken your waistline very much. a lot of cupcakes and double bacon cheeseburgers will thicken your waistline. That'll do a lot more for thickening your waistline than deadlifts ever will. Just food for thought. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.